Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of The Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. In this video, I'm going to cover Chapter 9 of the book, which is titled The Evidence of Biological Information, The Challenge of DNA and the Origin of Life. Strobel describes the amazing complexity of DNA. He mentions the Human Genome Project, which mapped the human genome, a map that would fill over 75,000 pages of the New York Times, Strobel says. He quotes President Clinton and the head of the Human Genome Project, Francis Collins, each of whom describe it by referencing God, calling it an attempt by humans to learn the language in which God created life and decode our own instruction book, which was previously known only to God. And Strobel writes, quote, "Are such public bows to a creator merely a polite social custom meant only as a nodding courtesy to a predominantly theistic country? Or does the bounty of information in DNA really warrant the conclusion that an intelligent designer must have infused genetic material with its protein-building instructions? Are there any naturalistic processes that can account for the appearance of biological data in the earliest cells?" The fact that Clinton, Collins, and many others chose to speak about the Human Genome Project in religiously tinged language doesn't mean anything as to whether or not DNA is actually a product of divine design. It's not bowing to a polite social custom or a conclusion warranted by the evidence. It's people who believe in God stating things in those terms. We can take it as their personal perspectives or assume they're speaking figuratively. It doesn't mean anything. Sometimes I say, "Oh my God," or "God only knows." I'm still an atheist. It doesn't mean I've concluded God must exist, or that I'm referencing something I believe to be real, or that I must presume the existence of God, as a presuppositionalist might say, in order to communicate in language. It's just figurative language. It's just the way people talk. It doesn't mean anything. Anyway, Strobel knows where he should go to get answers about where DNA came from and whether or not God had anything to do with it. Where does he go? Who does he talk to? What expert does he consult? Stephen Meyer. I know. Didn't he already talk to Stephen Meyer in this book? Yes, he did. But why work more than you have to? Right? Just as a reminder, in case you've forgotten, Meyer is a creationist and a senior fellow at the Discovery Institute, which is apparently the unofficial sponsor of The Case for a Creator. It's certainly their major talent supplier, wouldn't you say? He studied the history of molecular biology and evolutionary theory, according to Strobel, in graduate school, and he has written about the supposed evidence of design in the genetic code. And just again, a reminder, in case you've forgotten from, I think, Chapter 4, when Meyer was the subject, he's not a scientist. He's never worked professionally as a scientist. He's never done scientific research. He used to teach philosophy. He doesn't even do that anymore. Now, at least at the point that Strobel speaks to him in this book, he is a full-time employee of the Discovery Institute. Strobel says he knows where to get the answers about the genetic code. He says, I know just who to talk to learn me up on this subject. And he goes to this guy who isn't a scientist. Strobel even goes so far as to describe Meyer as one of the country's leading experts on origin of life issues. Not a biologist, not a chemist, not a geneticist, not any kind of scientist. And yet he's one of the leading experts on the origin of life. Okay, sorry, but I don't believe the field of abiogenesis research is that intellectually bereft. Creationism, on the other hand, I mean, he's talking to the same dude twice. Meyer says that the problem of the origin of life is also the problem of the origin of biological information. Just as a computer needs additional programming before it can perform a new function, an organism needs to be provided with new genetic instructions for how to do something new. But where did all this genetic information come from? The origin of information in DNA, Meyer tells Strobel, is best explained by an intelligent cause. And what does he mean by information? Meyer is referring to the 4 letters of DNA. That's what he means by information, the nucleobases that comprise DNA, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine, represented by the letters A, G, C, and T. It's appropriate that they are represented by letters, Meyer says, because they function as alphabetic characters in the genetic text. Next, Meyer gets out some visual aids to explain to Strobel how proteins work. He gets these snap-lock beads, and he has them of various different shapes, and they can be attached to each other in many different arrangements. And he explains that, like the beads, amino acids arrange themselves with each other to form proteins, and that arrangement determines the physical characteristics of the protein, which in turn determines what other parts of a cell with which that protein can interact. In other words, the shape or the characteristic of the protein determines the protein's function. And without seeming to realize it, Meyer, to my mind anyway, is undermining his entire argument. You don't need to appeal to an intelligent designer to solve the mystery of DNA once you recognize that it's all just molecules behaving and interacting with each other according to their physical properties. That's it. I mean, that's it is an incredibly reductive and dismissive way to refer to it. It's mind-bogglingly complex, and I don't pretend to understand it on anything other than the very basic level at which I studied it in college. And as some of you may recall me mentioning before, I was an English major, not a biology major. But it's not magic. It doesn't defy natural explanation. Meyer and Strobel and pretty much every other apologist/creationist who makes these intelligent design arguments try to mystify what's actually taking place at the genetic level. They talk about DNA in terms of information and language because those phrases in their casual, everyday, non-scientific usages are preloaded with the implication of intelligence. How can our genes contain information and be written like a language unless someone intelligent wrote it that way and someone intelligent was meant to read it eventually? Look at how Meyer, aided by Strobel, tries to mislead us to thinking of DNA not as something that is analogous to a language or a code or a computer program, but as literally that. Meyer quotes Bill Gates describing DNA as being like a software program, only much more complex than anything we have ever devised. Then Meyer says, that's highly suggestive, because we know how complex computer software is, but it's not highly suggestive of anything in the way that Meyer is implying. It's Bill Gates, software billionaire, describing DNA by drawing an analogy that he knows people listening to him will understand. It neither proves nor suggests anything about what DNA actually is, how it works, or where it came from. Oh wow, Bill Gates said DNA is even more complex than the software they create at Microsoft. If someone had to program all that software, then someone must have had to program DNA too. But at the most fundamental level, things operate as Meyer describes them to Strobel using the snap-lock beads. Amino acids combine to form proteins. The sequence of the amino acids determines the shape of the protein, and the shape of the protein determines its function. It's complex, it's fascinating, it's wondrous. But at the very bottom, it's molecules doing things. Meyer argues that since we know from experience that information is always associated with intelligence, logically we should assume that the origin of the information in DNA was due to an intelligence putting it there or designing it in that way. Except the information in question here is in the form of molecules interacting with each other according to their physical characteristics. It's not as though there are literally billions of tiny A's and G's and C's and T's in the nuclei of our cells writing out instructions for what to do. We know the building blocks of life can form naturally. We've seen this demonstrated experimentally. We know these compounds exist in the circumstellar disks of distant stars where solar systems are in the early stages of forming. We can be reasonably sure these compounds existed on the primordial Earth. That's the information Meyer is trying to convince us we can't explain the existence of naturally. Molecules interacting with each other according to their physical characteristics. Molecules that we know are formed naturally. The basic information is there. It's part of nature. It forms as a part of naturally occurring chemical processes. It becomes part of the genetic code through random mutation, most of which turns out to not be useful, but some of which turns out to be very useful. Over millions and billions of years and countless generations, quite a lot of useful information can accumulate in that way. Well, Strobel is persuaded, shocked, I am shocked, but he proposes a caveat to Meyer. His theory is true, assuming you can't find a better explanation. Nope, not how that works. Meyer's DNA is information and information means intelligence theory is not rooted in the facts. It is rooted in mischaracterization and misunderstanding of the facts. And we should not assume that it is true even if every other proposed explanation falls completely apart. This is yet another of the many, many obvious points that creationists miss either due to their ignorance or their dishonest intentions. Everybody else being wrong doesn't make you automatically right. Even if it were shown that evolution is not a valid theory, that doesn't mean creationism is valid. It doesn't mean that any other proposed explanation is valid. Your theory is right because the evidence shows that it's right, not because a competing theory is wrong. Creationists spend a lot of time trying to discredit evolution because they have no compelling evidence for their own claims. So it's really the only choice they've got. It's their only play. But even if they succeed in discrediting evolution, it's still not enough. They need to show why they've got the right answer. And they can't. At least, they've never been able to up to this point. Of course, Meyer doesn't see it this way. He sees lots of evidence for his creationist theories. One thing he doesn't see evidence for, however, is the prebiotic soup, in which many scientists believe the building blocks of life first came together to form the earliest cells. Strobel asks how much evidence there is for this prebiotic soup he's heard so much about, and Meyer replies, there isn't any evidence. Meyer suggests that because amino acids are nitrogenous, we should expect to find nitrogen-rich minerals in the earliest sediments of Earth, but no such deposits have ever been located. But I'm not so sure we should expect to find the kind of nitrogen-rich rocks in the earliest sediments that Meyer says we should. And anyone with more knowledge of this subject than me, please feel free to share it in the comments if I've got something wrong here or I'm missing something. But Adam Lee wrote a very good series responding to this book about 8 years ago on his blog, Daylight Atheism, and I will link to that series in the description of the video, and specifically to the articles that respond to this chapter, because he wrote several articles in response to each chapter of the book. I think he wrote 3 or 4 in response to various facets of this chapter. And in one of his articles responding to this chapter, he makes what seems like a good point to me. Earth is home to a massive amount of organic molecules. And we know this for a fact because most of those molecules are currently being used by organisms. Organisms are made of organic molecules, and there's a ton of life on Earth. So there's a ton of organic molecules on this planet. And Earth, molecularly speaking at least, is pretty much a closed system. Sure, we've had some asteroid or comet impacts over the years, but cumulatively, those have not really increased the number of molecules, the number of atoms on Earth all that much. Most of the physical material that is a part of this planet, including the material that makes up living things like us, has been here all along, has been here since the planet formed, since the solar system formed, 4 billion years ago. We're all just recycling the same stuff. So it seems to me that whether it was a prebiotic soup or something else, some kind of environment must have existed that allowed these molecules to come together to form life forms. We know the building blocks were here because we've detected them in other young star systems and because they're here now. And we know at some point life appeared. In other words, these various molecular compounds began interacting with each other in ways which we would describe as being alive at some point. Now, not every scientist believes that the prebiotic soup was important to the origin of life, or that it even existed. Once again, disproving another theory is not the same as proving yours. Even if there was no prebiotic soup, there are other possibilities. For example, some scientists believe life originated deep beneath the ocean near hydrothermal vents. No prebiotic soup necessary. Meyer tells Strobel that there's no evidence for the prebiotic soup, and Strobel reacts like, wow, I am so astounded, but scientists talk about it all the time and everything. But even if we grant Meyer that there was no prebiotic soup, that doesn't mean life couldn't have originated naturally. I can't stress this enough. Life is a wondrous thing, but it's not magic. Life is the result of molecules doing things. And as I said already, saying that's it sounds reductive and dismissive of such a complex and amazing thing, but that's it. Meyer dismisses the idea that life arose purely by chance. He says, imagine trying to generate a simple book by throwing Scrabble letters onto the floor, or trying to reproduce Hamlet by picking random letters out of a bag. Well, see, he's doing the DNA is like a language bit again. Letters in alphabets assemble to form words because we assemble them according to rules we invented and which are continually evolving and changing. Letters are symbols. We give them meaning. They don't inherently mean anything or do anything. The letters that form particular words are not naturally drawn to each other. The letters in Hamlet didn't arrange themselves that way because their physical characteristics compelled them to. They were placed in that arrangement by an intelligence. Meyer wants you to think that the molecules of DNA must have been placed in the particular arrangements we find them in as a part of genetic codes by an intelligence as well. But unfortunately for him, molecules don't work the same way that letters do. The building blocks of DNA do arrange themselves in particular ways due to their physical characteristics. They do interact with each other in ways that can be described and predicted and understood according to the laws of physics and chemistry. They are not abstract concepts or symbols giving arbitrary meanings. They are objects that behave in certain ways according to their inherent characteristics. Letters and words only do what we make them do. Molecules do what they do naturally. So, yes, if you put hundreds of thousands of letters written on tiles into a sack, a really big sack with hundreds of thousands of letters, and then you mix them up and dump them out, and they were perfectly arranged to spell out Hamlet, that would be amazing. I'd want to know how that magic trick was done. But if you put organic molecules in a sack, so to speak, and mix them up, and find that eventually they begin to form amino acids and proteins and eventually living cells, that's still amazing, but it's not magic. It's just nature. Well, next is a truly infuriating section where Meyer and Strobel attempt to refute the claim that natural selection could have produced the first organisms, a claim I have never heard any scientist actually make. Meyer himself says pre-biological natural selection is a contradiction in terms. Yeah, I know, right? Strobel introduces the possibility, asking Meyer if natural selection could have produced the first living cell. And from that point on, they treat Strobel's ignorant misunderstanding of natural selection as though it's a mainstream position of the scientific community that needs to be addressed. Strobel even sets it up by describing Richard Dawkins's illustration of Mount Improbable, where he explains how the many minute changes that are caused by mutation and shaped by natural selection can allow evolution to produce extremely complex, seemingly improbable biological structures. Now, There are some abiogenesis researchers who believe that a process roughly analogous to Darwinian natural selection may have played a role in the origin of life. For example, if certain chemical reactions produced complex organic molecules more quickly than others, or which were more stable than others, then the products of those reactions would presumably have become more abundant than the products of slower or less reliable reactions. But while that is analogous to Darwinian natural selection, it is not the process Strobel is referencing or Dawkins is describing when he talks about climbing Mount Improbable or explaining how evolution works. Strobel takes 2 pages describing an illustration of natural selection that he knows does not apply to the conversation he is presenting in the chapter. He's writing the chapter after he interviews Meyer. He's not transcribing this in real time. He knows that natural selection played no part in the origin of life because Darwinian natural selection is something that happens during biological evolution, and there was no biological evolution before there was a biological something. He knows it's irrelevant and distracting and potentially confusing to people who aren't well-versed in the subject, and yet he includes it anyway. Then he and Meyer spend 4 pages refuting this argument that no one but them actually made. It's one of the flimsiest, most pathetic straw men I've ever seen in an apologetics book. Next, Meyer and Strobel address something like the argument that I've been making, that life is the result of molecules just doing what they naturally do. And this is unlikely to be the explanation, Meyer says, because living things are not merely complex, they are specifically complex. That is, they are the product of molecules interacting with each other in specific ways, not just any old natural way. Right. That's probably why I've never heard an actual scientist say that life results any time you put the right building blocks together in the right environment. Specified complexity is a concept that has been co-opted by creationists like Meyer, and more so by William Dembski, who has argued on the basis of bad math and meaningless probabilities that the specified complexity we observe in life could not possibly have resulted from natural processes. But specified complexity, as defined and understood by actual scientists, is a valid concept, and it is something that can and does arise in nature. It is not the product of intelligence and intelligence only, as Meyer insists in his interview with Strobel. Of course, life is not the inevitable result of any interactions between organic molecules. No one ever said it was. Perhaps life is a relatively rare result, one that depends on many factors that are difficult to balance, circumstances that are difficult to reproduce. I'm fine with that. I don't think that threatens naturalistic explanations of abiogenesis, nor do I think it threatens evolution or naturalism in general. We live on a planet full of organic molecules that have been interacting with each other for billions of years. When life first appeared in its original and simplest form, they had probably already been interacting for millions of years. Countless interactions, experiments, if you will, occurring simultaneously, probably in many different locations for millions of years. Out of those countless experiments, life only had to be the result one time. It may have been the result more than once, but it only had to happen for us to be here once. Us and every other form of life we have ever found is the result, after billions of years of evolution, of life arising once. That's the only, it only had to happen one time. It could have been a 1 in 10 billion shot. It only had to happen once. And I'm sorry, but I just don't see what's supposed to leave me so incredulous that I reject any possibility of a natural explanation and assume that the only way this could have happened was by some unsubstantiated, vague, intelligent designer. Or, if we skip the intentional vagueness and get right to the real conclusion Strobel and his interviewees are driving at, by a miracle. I'm being told that an improbable thing happened, but also that it had millions of years and who knows how many opportunities during that time to happen. All the raw material was here. There was plenty of time. We don't yet know exactly how it happened, but why is it so hard to believe that it did happen, given all those opportunities and all that time without divine intervention? And the answer is, it's not hard to believe. It's only hard to believe if divine intervention is the answer you already decided you're going to get before you even started researching the question. And for what feels like the billionth time since I started doing these series, I have to say, that's not science. And talking about it as though it is science doesn't make it science and doesn't make it true. Well, that's it for the chapter. That's it for this video. I will be back in the next video to take a look at chapter 10 of the book, which is The Evidence of Consciousness, the enigma of the mind. I wonder what neuroscientist he will be talking to discuss that, or maybe a neuropsychologist. He's going to talk about consciousness and the origin of the mind, and I just know he's going to talk to an incredibly qualified person who has done professional work and research and published extensively in one of those relevant fields. I just know it. Anyway, that's it. Thank you all so much for watching. As always, if you have a comment, if you have a response to something I've had to say, whether you are an atheist or a Christian or some other variety of believer or non-believer, please do leave a comment. Let me know what you have to say. Please, please, please consider supporting this channel and supporting this work that I do by becoming a patron of this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron for as little as $1 a month. If you pledge a larger amount per month, say $5 a month or more, you can take advantage of some extra perks, including shout-outs in particular videos and sneak peeks at scripts for certain videos, including this series for as long as it lasts. It's almost over. But yeah, $5 a month gets you all that. $1 a month is still super appreciated. And even those of you who are not patrons for whatever reason, but are still viewers and are watching and are sharing and are commenting and doing all those other wonderful things that you do to support me and help spread these videos and keep this whole thing going. I appreciate you so, so much. And I'll see you next time.